Well, welcome to this panel. It's quite a formidable task to follow Ariel, especially as she clearly knows what she's talking about, and I'm never sure that I know what I'm talking about. But I want to welcome our three panelists, we have a very brief synopsis of each one, but the fuller CV is in the little exhibition booklet. Eduardo Abaroa. His work investigates the practices of archaeology and anthropology in relation to pre-Hispanic cultures in Mexico. His project, I'm going to read the English version, Project for the Demolition of the Museum of Anthropology, which I think, Eduardo, is an edited version of the original, yeah? Which is now displayed in the exhibition, meditates on the Mexican state's simultaneous fascination with pre-colonial indigenous cultures and its disenfranchisement and oppression of indigenous groups in the present. Mabe Bethônico works in dialogue with archives and other institutions, testing the limits between documentation and construction. Her Museum of Public Concerns is a mobile photographic digital archive that brings collections from individuals, indigenous groups, NGOs, and others into public visibility. Since 2008, Mabe has conducted research related to the mining industry in Minas Gerais, southeast Brazil, where she has investigated the political dimensions of memory and the public archive in relation to the extraction industry. Fernando Palma Rodríguez originally trained as an industrial engineer. His work uses recycled materials to animate zoomorphic forms with robotic movements. These objects combine outsider science and improvised electronic programming with cosmological perspectives drawn from his Nahuatl language and culture. He is a founding member of Calpulli Tecalco, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to the restoration of the natural environment, history, and culture of the people of Milpalta, the region to the southeast of Mexico City. Before I call the panelists, and Eduardo, if we can start with you, I just would like to make a few introductory comments. They're sort of like a tracing of the history of what I knew as I got engaged with this scenario. The first thing is, who are officially regarded as indigenous people? There's something like 360 million indigenous people in the world. There's no clear official definition, although the UN instituted several mandates to protect indigenous rights. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was first drafted in 1985. And Jimmy Durham was AIM's representative on the International Treaty Council during the early 80s. And I suspect that he had something to do with the drafting of this first attempt at the Declaration. However, the Declaration was not adopted by the Human Rights Council until 2007. It explicitly identifies indigenous peoples as having been subjected to colonial dispossession and/or cultural marginalization by nation states, whilst struggling to retain ancestral lands, languages, and cultures. The draft is not legally binding. Even so, settler states, notably the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Israel, have not unconditionally ratified it. In the past, there's been little justice for indigenous peoples and their ways of life that was not hard-won by indigenous grassroots activism. During the 60s and 70s, when they sought self-determination, they were met with counterinsurgency state violence, assassination, and imprisonment. As the 80s progressed, they increasingly lobbied settler governments over the despoliation of their land and water security by fossil fuel and mining corporations, and by herbicides and pesticides introduced by agribusinesses, which, together with Big Pharma, now practice biopiracy, as TJ mentioned this morning. In 89-90, the Kogi of Colombia's High Sierras broke centuries of voluntary isolation to make a film warning us of climate change, and that was before many of our own scientists would actually believe the evidence. That same year, as Subakan has noted, the first Rights of Nature book was published, citing white activists. But whites rarely listened to indigenous peoples. The Kogi have since made a second film, which basically says, you weren't listening, were you? So we're going to tell you again. So there has been an immense conceptual gulf between Eurocentric and indigenous American worldviews. We could mention traditional social systems, summed up in Cherokee philosopher Brian Yazzie Burkhart's riposte to Descartes, we think, therefore I am, or oral traditions. In one of his books, the late Lakota Sioux lawyer Vine Deloria Jr. notes that in 19th century judicial proceedings, Indian oral testimonies were discounted since only written accounts by whites were admissible in court as truth. But for native peoples, oral transmission spoke the archive, and therefore nothing but the truth. Or think of cosmology. Western science is built on Newtonian physics and Cartesianism, which assume an objective view of a world regarded as measurable and hierarchical. And this privileged point of view was complicit with the racist constructs of imperialism. Meanwhile, indigenous knowledge was dismissed as primitive and inconsequential. However, as the Tewa Pueblo scholar Gregory Cajete points out, Native American science actually correlates with quantum mechanics, popularly known as chaos theory or the butterfly effect. Here the observer is an active agent in any observation. Chaos and creativity dynamically coexist. Everything is process, and processes are irreducibly relational and interdependent. So what practical alliances are possible between the aims of environmentalists and the needs of indigenous peoples? If I've been skeptical, it is because I am mindful of the past and what Frantz Fanon said in Black Skin, White Masks. And I quote, "When the whites feel that they have become too mechanized, they turn to the men of color and ask them for a little sustenance." Hopefully, things are changing, at least so far in this conference. It does make me a little less skeptical. So perhaps I can call Eduardo.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be in the same project as so many talented people. I thank every one of you and for your presence. I am probably a little bit, I'm working as an artist in Mexico City. I started introducing myself because I'm not an activist or my work doesn't even relate to the history of activism or anything of the sort. I basically have tried to analyze several institutions or several art practices in my country. For example, urban sculpture or even the making of toys or stuff from an ideological perspective. In this case, In 2012, I made a project that has a very direct relationship to this event. I was very mad at the situation in Viricuta, a place where you might probably know as the place where peyote is grown in central Mexico. And they were having a lot of problems with the Canadian mining company that tried to extract silver from the land. And there was a whole campaign that went on about this. It is very interesting to me that I was very new to the topic, but what happened with this situation inspired me to do this other work that I had already, that I'm going to present to you. So here, the pieces I'm going to read a little bit because if not, it's going to be really long. The pieces I present in the Rights of Nature show belong to a body of work that began in 2012 as an installation in an art gallery and gradually included photography, drawing, group discussions, writing, etc. The project is entitled Total Destruction of the Anthropology Museum, and it was presented in the Curimansuto Gallery in Mexico City. It all started out as an intricate thought experiment, inspired by the anger and frustration that I felt during the celebration of the 200 years of the Mexican independence. How do I... Okay. The Anthropology Museum is the most important example of Mexican 20th century architecture. It was conceived in the early 1960s by President Adolfo López Mateos, his Secretary of Education, Jaime Torres Bodet, and architect Pedro Ramírez Vázquez, among others. It was completed in 1964. The collection of pre-Hispanic objects that had been kept in the small Museo Nacional or national museums since the independence needed a larger building so that these treasures could be enjoyed by the people of Mexico. Even if the Revolutionary Party or PRI was already starting to show affinity towards capitalism, each president was still temporary dictator during the 6-year period. President López Mateos directly commissioned the Museum of Anthropology as a very important part of his legacy. He agreed to commit all the necessary resources to the project on condition that it would be finished before the end of his term. The museum was built in 18 months. Architect Ramírez Vázquez was already a strong presence in Mexican culture. He traveled to many museums in the world to study the way they function. It is evident that he adopted a very late version of modernism, but he also integrated pre-Hispanic and even colonial Catholic motifs. The main plan of the museum is inspired on the Louvre in Paris. Ramírez Vázquez observed that many times the spectators felt trapped inside the French palace. So he designed a central patio which allows for people to walk between museum halls at their leisure. Here's the main hall, the main patio, excuse me. The building as a whole is inspired on a Mayan architecture. The ground level is designated to the archaeological treasures, and the second floor is designated to the indigenous peoples of the present. So here you can see the main patio of the museum. This is the architect. The Anthropology Museum is Ramírez Vázquez's most accomplished work, but he also designed other important buildings in Mexico like the Shrine of Guadalupe, the Aztec Stadium, and even the logo of the largest media company. He eventually became the most important Mexican architect of the century. His ability to give gracious form to the official ideology by combining the pre-Hispanic with the modern is very appreciated until today. He passed away very recently. The museum was conceived as a complex didactic tool which would house the archaeological treasures of ancient Mexico and make them available for a growing population. Its program embodies very specific ideas that eventually conformed a new nationalism after the Mexican Revolution. This Mexican Revolution happened in 1910. The essay Forjando Patria, Forging a Nation by anthropologist Manuel Gamio is a classic text which permitted a re-evaluation of the indigenous peoples in Mexico. Gamio rejected the idea of the cultural inferiority of indigenous people. He believed that cultural diversity within the Mexican territory was an asset to the new country that would rise from the revolution. Gamio's ideas are an essential component of Mexican nationalism. The science of anthropology, in his opinion, would play a critical role for the new regime. Its task would be to study all these pequeñas patrias, or small nations, to understand all the ethnic groups in order to better integrate and unify a strong Mexican national identity. Another important reference for the ideological genealogy of this museum is José Vasconcelos, a notorious writer, lawyer, politician, and educator responsible for the education policy of the revolutionary government. The museum is, in a certain way, a culmination of his educational program, but Vasconcelos' notion of mestizaje implied the integration of all these cultures of Mexico, or even the cultures in Latin America, into one cosmic race. In both instances, the knowledge of the indigenous groups was important only as part of a larger ideological program. In 1964, when the museum was built, indigenous children were still forced to learn Spanish. The Museum of Anthropology was set up by a fantastic team of scholars like Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, Miguel León Portilla, Eduardo Matos, etc. Many of the top artists of the time made site-specific works for the building. What does it take to demolish the museum? This is a question that I ask. The first phase of the project involved consulting a professional demolition expert to figure out the steps required to destroy the building. Following all necessary security precautions and trying to optimize resources like machinery, recycling, transportation, etc. The only difference from a regular demolition process is that I propose to destroy all the contents of the museum, the pre-Hispanic pieces, the ethnographic collection, museum paraphernalia, articles from the gift store, etc. The installation conveyed the proposed demolition process with a series of props, sketches, and video. Here's the gradual destruction through different methods. There's a color for each method. I'll go very quickly. This is the way we can see it disappear. This is a visualization of the general view of the installation. Aluminum would also be recycled. Excuse me. You can see an example here. Glass is one of the most characteristic materials used in the museum. It would be recycled in its entirety. Aluminum would also be recycled. It was used for the windows. This material had been recently adopted as a construction material. One of the most important Mexican modernist artists at the time, Manuel Fergueres, made an aluminum lattice inspired by Mayan decorations. This slide shows a representation of the debris left after tearing down the building with excavators. The engineer told me that the use of explosives did not make any sense in this case, for the building is too light to crumble under its own weight. 6 excavators would be efficiently used to tear apart the concrete. The process would last about 3 months. In this pile of rubbish, the chunks of marble and concrete hide fragments of archaeological and ethnographic objects, touristic souvenirs, etc. I used official replicas of the archaeological pieces and also made some myself. The engineer also told me that the most difficult and expensive part of the whole process would be to get rid of of all the debris. The image in the back, it's a video projection that shows the disintegration of the Coatlinchan monolith. This huge rock represents a deity whose identity is not known. It is commonly referred to as Tlaloc, the god of rain, but some archaeologists, especially non-Mexican, believe it is Chalchihuitlicue, a goddess of spring and river waters. The Mexican president himself suggested to bring the monolith to decorate the entrance of the museum, given that its archaeological value at the time was not as great as a Mayan work that could not be left outdoors. The piece is an unfinished artwork that was still attached to the ground when it was transported from the town of Coatlinchan to Mexico City. The local population rebelled against the president's wish and even sabotaged the track that had been especially designed to transport the monolith. After a very bitter struggle and the intervention of a rural teacher, the locals agreed to let the sculpture go in exchange for roads, electricity, and a free entrance to the museum for the rest of their lives. The arrival of the monolith was a huge media event in Mexico City. The stone was paraded around town until it was located in the place it still occupies today. There was a huge storm in Mexico City that day, almost as if the god or goddess had brought the rain with him. And some in Coatlinchan said that the rain has left the town ever since. In the year 2007, Governor Peña Nieto, the now president of Mexico, commissioned a replica to be returned to the town of Coatlinchan. To me, this sculpture represents many things. Perhaps the most important of them, it represents the almost absolute power of the Mexican presidents, whose authority cannot be questioned without consequence. In my project, I decided that this piece should be destroyed by explosives, because the demolition expert told me that in many cases politicians who commissioned the demolition insisted on using explosives even if they were not needed, for they created a fantastic spectacle. The column of the central patio that we saw is made with very strong concrete. Excavation would take too much time to tear it down. Excavators would take too much time to tear it down. So the appropriate method would be to use expansive cement. This substance is poured into a set of holes that have been previously drilled in the column. The cement gradually expands with such strength that it tears the structures from within, making the task easier for the excavators and lowering costs. This is a material example of how you use this thing. The cement is this dust that you find under these two columns, and I didn't use any hammer or anything, it just expanded and broke the concrete. This piece, for example, also represents part of the museum. Other objects in the museum, such as this wooden structure or perhaps the books in the library, would be more efficiently destroyed with fire. So the show at the gallery implies a sculptural endeavor. It's not about information per se. Although it tried to mimic the way that objects are displayed in the museum. And so it was excuse me. The total destruction of the Anthropology Museum is a hyperbolic fantasy which opens a discussion on the instrumentalization of the indigenous cultures of Mexico, past and present. Many spectators are very critical of the work, mentioning the lack of respect to national symbols. Why would someone destroy an institution that has helped millions of people, children, tourists, citizens, scientists, understand the cultures of our country? Mexico is always haunted by its indigenous component. The definition of Mexican nationality itself during the revolution in 1910 relies heavily on anthropology, given that it was a tool to unify just a century ago a territory that was inhabited by a very large number of diverse ethnic groups. The 20th century was a good period of integration. The museum glorified the past, but was a tool to unify the complexity of these societies sometimes even deliberately destroying the cultures it glorified, their languages, etc. The demolition of this anthropology museum should be seen as the recognition of its obsolescence as an instrument for knowledge, an obsolescence which many of its creators are well aware of, given its partial view of the indigenous problem. But also, the demolition project embodies, ironically, the neoliberal wishful thinking that this problem will just fade away into modernity. In my project, I do not get out of the museum into the real Mexico. I'm always trapped. I have refused to go out of it for the length of the project. My critique is trapped inside the institution in order to think about its inner workings. The show in the gallery is completed by a series of guided tours. I invite people to see the museum from a different perspective, given an insight explanation of what the process of demolition might be, but also generating a discussion of the motivations and concerns behind this project. So here I'm going to be a little bit more spontaneous in my presentation. It's always important to be fast with the description of the project in the first phase. Now I'm going to show you some images. This is a way that the museum is actually used by the powerful in Mexico. All these people are very powerful entrepreneurs, politicians, etc., and they go and make their events. It is rented for the top luxury events in the city. In this case, it's a benefit auction trying to promote benefit projects for entrepreneurs. These are some of the companies that sponsor the museum. At the beginning, it was a completely state-sponsored institution, but now, gradually, as many institutions in Mexico and perhaps in the world, it has been very it has gone into private sponsorship. Some of them are quite questionable. Televisa, for example, is very keen into destroying or trying to lobby against indigenous radio, which are essential to many communities. And Cinemex is actually a movie theater company owned by Grupo México, a mining company, the largest in Mexico, who is also responsible for quite a few terrible accidents in the environment. So you can see that they somehow it's somehow contradictory the way they propose this. In the museum, we have this. I always go there and feel the sense that the museum tries to make these cultures that people know them, but at the same time, it also tries to destroy them. No, and this happens a lot, even since the conquest of Mexico. Even much of what we know with people like we were talking about Diego de Landa the other day, or even Bartolomé, all of them were basically writing down all the information on these cultures in order to evangelize better. And you have this sense also in the museum that the museum is still lending a place to knowledge that it somehow is undermining in the background. No? Well, we have this touristic photograph there. I'll go quickly. Some of these pictures are only I took hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and I just selected ones that gave me some idea of how the interesting moments of how the museum works. It is interesting that the epistemology of the museum is outdated. These are the entrances of each hall, but they do not relate to what is the current studies of these cultures, and they have been left like that almost as some kind of relic. The architect himself, they tell me, went every Wednesday to see that everything was exactly as he had left it, or he was supervising constantly. So it's interesting to me is it's not only historic in terms of relating to an historic past, but it's also an interesting thing to see, to go back in history at the time of the museum. No? Some of these signs have been remodeled now, but they just, many of the archaeologists even agree that the knowledge that is present in the museum is obsolete already, in terms scientifically. I try to. I don't have much time left, but I'm trying. What I'm trying to do in the notes that we see in the museum, in the Nottingham Museum, is to do sort of like an aftermath of the project in the gallery. Many people told me, well, if you don't like this museum, what would you do? And I'm like, well, okay, let's do something. Let's try to imagine a museum that had a different kind of information. The reason I don't like the museum is basically that it is very much focused on the past of indigenous cultures, and it very little shows the people all the geopolitical consequences, all the processes that are involved and that affect indigenous people. I think that this is something that many artists in this show do. They try to locate different processes in which the culture and biology and geology and industry intertwine and create very interesting assemblages. And I think that a museum or the museum I envision could do that. For example, in the case of corn in Mexico, Mexico is the center of origin of corn, as many of you may well know. And we now are facing the constant threat of transgenic introduction of this seed. This seed will completely demolish, completely destroy the field in Mexico, because it depends on the free trade of seeds, and this is what keeps the corn alive. If you introduce just one variety, you can't grow it. Mexico is a very diverse country geologically, so you can't plant corn in the mountain and then near the sea or something. It has to be different varieties. So we have to preserve this biocultural legacy. There's this scientist who Sarukan, who's saying that if you just keep a genetic information in some kind of genetic bank or something, it would be like wanting to see a movie with just one square. In the case of corn, for example, we need to preserve the whole process of biology intertwined with culture. So, well, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
In my work, I have been making circulate content about Brazilian context. I think this light is a bit disturbing. I can't see anyway. Great, thank you. So I've been trying to make circulate content about Brazilian context that's not otherwise available. So I do that through my work as a vehicle sort of way, and searching to discuss certain issues with a certain emphasis on mining, but in some pieces it's not necessarily directly related to mining. As in the Museum of Public Concerns, there are various issues that we are tackling, including the production or the thinking of the Machacali indigenous group in Minas Gerais. I'm not directly speaking about them either, but I started a project 2 years ago about a traveler, geographer, who went to Brazil in the 50s in a mission of UNESCO. And his mission was to map the mineral richness of the northeast of Brazil. And he made a report and a physical map about all that he had located in terms of richness. Apparently it was to help develop economically the region. It's the Caatingas, the white forest of Brazil, complete the opposite of the abundance of the Amazon that's very seductive to the world. It's a place with I cannot go on very deeply about the Caatinga, but it's very affective to all Brazilians, affective in the same way that the Amazon affects us. But it's very unknown, and it's much less green, and it's the semi-desert of Brazil. But and think what was happening in these mines today, who made use of this map. So I proposed to do a translation of this book without speaking French, so I stayed 1.5 years translating word by word, and it was through this book that I also went to the Caatinga, which I've never been before. So I adopted in my work for the first time the whole of translation, and for this evening today, this day, I thought I could do that again in a way, translating another French book that I've been trying to dig out, which is a book written by a Frenchman together with a Brazilian shaman, Yanomami, Davi Kopenauer. It's a very thick, important book that has been circulating since 2010, but it circulates only in French, and it never came out in Portuguese as well. And symptomatically, the relevance of this book, it came in 2013 in English, and so until now it hasn't been published in Brazil. But apparently will be published by the end of this year, otherwise I would have done it myself, but I came in late. It took me too long to learn French with my author, Aubert de la Rue. So what I decided to do today, I brought some images of Aubert de la Rue, of other contexts. It's to do with the Caatinga, but it's to do with a collection of all over the world that he was collecting throughout his whole career. He died in the 90s, and he made a huge compilation of fences all over places he went. So I brought a collection of this, so you can look at that while I read portions of this book by Davi Kopenauer. I selected a portion of the book where he discusses what is ecology for him. It's a bit fragmented the way I brought it, because he can be quite repetitive in his discourse, and I try to make it short for the time we have here. So Davi is a very important shaman from the Yanomami. It's very up north. The Amazon. The Yanomami are a very important symbol for Brazilian culture and love of the Amazon, because they're quite emblematic, resistant. They were discovered since the 18th century. They knew the existence of them, but they were known as very violent until the 19th century. And they were only effectively contacted in the 60s. Right at the 70s, this French author who wrote the book with him, his name is Bruce Albert, he began to go to the tribe. Bruce was very young, and he lived throughout the decades going there to the Amazon and living with Davi. They had enormous exchanges. Bruce learned their language, and apparently it says in the book that Davi asked Bruce to write a book with what he was saying, like a testimony. So the thick book has a lot of the speeches of Davi, the exchanges between them, and Bruce obviously looks at the Yanomami in his anthropological studies. So we go through the images, and somewhere they will relate to the text of Davi. So right before we'll start with the images, and I just have to quote in another chapter where he speaks about ecology. He explains what Omama is. We need to know what Omama is so you understand better the text. He defines, Omama is who created the earth and the forest, the wind, the leaves, and the rivers from where we drink water. It is him who gave us life and made us many. Our ancestors since always say his name. So we keep in mind this Omama. He goes on then in the chapter about ecology, which I sort of cut out in fragments. Omama was at times the center of what the whites call ecology. It's true, much before these words existed amongst them, and of which they speak so much, it was already between us, without us calling in the same way. Since always, the words from the spirits to protect the forest exists for the shamans. If we had books like them, the whites could note how these words are old. In the forest, it is us, the human beings, which are the ecology. But it is just as much the shapiri. Shapiri are the spirits of the things in the forests. So for us, just as much the shapiri, the game, the trees, the rivers, the fish, the sky, the wind, and the sun. It is all that is existing in the forest, far from the whites, and that is still not surrounded by fences. The words of ecology are our ancient words, those which Omama has given to our ancestors. The shapiri, he says, shapiri again is the spirit embedded in all things in the forest, in all things. The shapiri defend the forest since it exists. It is because they had them on their side that our ancestors had never devastated it. Isn't it still alive? The whites, who on the other hand ignore those things, start today to understand. It's because some of them have invented new words to protect the forest. They call them people of ecology, as they are worried to see their earth becoming more and more hot. So elsewhere, Davi continues. In the old days, our ancients could not make the whites understand their words about the forest, as they didn't know their words, their language. And those, as they arrived in their home, had not yet spoken of ecology. They demanded jaguar skins, deer skins. At that time, they didn't have any of these words to protect the forest. They appeared in their cities not long ago until they ended up saying, oh, we have dirtied our lands and our rivers, and our forest is shrinking. It is necessary to protect the little left under the name of ecology. I think they got feared to see devastated the places where they live. In the beginning, when I was young, very young, I never heard the whites speak of protecting nature. It was much later, while I was angry and began to speak against the gold miners and their illnesses shawara, that suddenly these new words came to my ears. Well, just a parenthesis here, these illnesses shawara were illnesses that the Indians always feared. With the arrival of people comes new viruses, and often they are discovering new illnesses and decimating the people, like it was with flu in the first place, and chicken pox and whatever people bring into the forest that throughout the ages have killed in many phases the Yanomami. So they have the illnesses, what they call shawara. So he continues, I think in Brazil it was Chico Mendes that made them spread everywhere, because I began to hear of that while the whites began to speak about him. This was very interesting that he quotes Chico Mendes. Chico Mendes was a rubber tapper in the 70s. Well, he was living inside the forest, a very poor sort of life. When he was 20, he was alphabetized, and he became a leader in the protection of the forest. And in such a scale of importance that he involved with the foundation of the Workers' Party, PT, the Brazilian PT, and he was key in spreading for the first time in Brazil the word of protecting the forest, 70s and 80s. And in the mid-80s, he was shot down. He was shot dead by farmers. Okay, so he mentions Chico Mendes as being this sort of porte-parole, this voice that for the first time is together with the sense of ecology for him. So he goes on. Once the stories of ecology appeared in the cities, our words about the forest could be understood. The whites began to listen to me. Our propositions could then spread far from our homes, drown on the skin of images or captured by those of television. I quite like this part when it says drown on the skin of images. It's not my translation, it's really what's there in French. So it's sort of a way of capturing the body of the image somehow. This is interesting. So for the first time it was visually being reproduced somewhere. This is what he's saying, I think. So he goes, it's because our thoughts are not as hidden as before. I thought, he continues, this is not my voice. I thought, now that the whites have invented their words of ecology, they cannot content themselves by repeating them in vain to do new lies. They must really protect the forest and all that lives, the game, the fishes, the spirits, and the humans. I'm a son of the first inhabitants of the forests, and their words became mine. Now I'll make the whites understand so they can be impregnated. When they speak about the forest, the whites often use another word, which is milieu naturel. That's in the book. And in Portuguese is meio ambiente. Both in French as in Portuguese, meio is environment at the same time as it is half. So he plays with this idea of half. So milieu naturel, meio ambiente. He's bothered by this idea. So he goes, this word is also not one of ours, and we ignore it until recently. For us, what the whites name like that is what is left of earth and forest cut with their machines. What is left from all that has been destroyed until now. I don't like this word milieu or meio. Earth should not be divided by half. We inhabit the forest, and if it's divided, we know we will die with it. I prefer that the whites speak of an entire nature or ecology. He has both nature and ecology in quotes. If we defend the forest in its totality, it will remain alive. If we divide it to protect the small parcels, which are not more than residue of what has been taken away, this will do no good. With some rests of trees, rests of waters, rests of games, fishes and humans that inhabit it, breath of life will be very short. This is why we are worried. If the whites speak today of protecting the nature, they should not lie as their older ones have done. We shamans will simply say that we protect the entire nature. In their place, the whites have devastated almost everything. They keep only some fragments, which they have surrounded by fences. I think now the intent is that they do the same with ours. I think now they intend to do what they have done to us. This saddens and worries us. I wouldn't like that my ones inhabit a rest of forest, neither that we become rests of human beings. Contrary to the whites, it's not the forest and the earth that we eat. We feed ourselves with the game, its fish, the fruits of its trees, the honey of its bees, and the plants of our gardens. Well, this is quite a focused sort of text that he's willing to sort of frame these ideas. But what I first was looking at his book was for a more cosmological that is also existent. But only I was already quite old when I first read indigenous legends and stories. And what I would like I also thought of bringing here was one of the stories that probably could also contribute to our discussion here that I couldn't find because this is so rare in Brazilian literature and also circulating. It wasn't easy for me to find this. But how they tell their stories, cosmological sort of explanations, where one thing derives into another and it's so unhierarchical. For example, you have a bird that devours a leaf, and the leaf speaks something, and then it falls on the floor and transforms into something else. And this is heard by a human, and the human dies from it. And there's all these stories like a chain of transformations until something becomes something. But I think in a way, this what Davi was saying in this portion brings a little bit of that. And he's sure to remark also all this spirituality related to Omama and Shapuri and all that. So that's it. And this is the images are from the Museum of Ethnography of Geneva. This is where the whole archive of Aube de la Rue is. And I had to go through all the production of photographs of de la Rue to locate where the Caatinga images were, because he was a very he was a collector of his own production in a very organized way by themes. So these are the defenses of all over the world to think about. Okay, thank you.
Paktia ni kanka, cosa ni pahpake ni mismitas. Nechpaktia ni mis tlapalos in milis in Malacachitepec Momoshko Tlaca. No toca Fernando, no Sengelis, ni toca a Huehuecoyotl. Tlazokamati ni palnepawani. Tlazokamati sentetl tonali sentetl huetzincapa. Xinichita, na nika topipilanzi, ximoitili, nocnewa, noaltlana, nomexicatlalna, enantlalna, yuquetlalna. Es lengua náhuatl, es la lengua que hablaron los aztecas, es la lengua que se habla en mi comunidad aún. Es una comunidad en las afueras del Distrito Federal de la Ciudad de México. Es una comunidad compuesta de 12 pueblos y que han funcionado desde tiempos prehispánicos como una confederación. En la actualidad estamos prácticamente a la orilla de la Ciudad de México. I'm speaking different languages just simply because I think it is important that we look after languages. Nahuatl is the language of the Aztecs. Where I come from, it is still spoken, but just by a very short fraction of people. I'm glad to say that some of them are young children, but the vast majority are older people, older than me. I'm really glad to be here because it gives me the opportunity to speak about where I come from, the Momoshka people. It is very little known, and I think it's, of course, assumed that 500 years it took place, the colonization of Mexico, what is all recognized today as Mexico. I'm afraid it isn't like that. We are a confederacy of 12 different towns that have functioned in such a way since pre-Hispanic days. But today, we are very close to Mexico City. We traveled to Mexico City today from our homeland into the center. It would take me, in good days, maybe 2 hours, actually, to the edge of, to the first underground station. And in bad days, depending on traffic, up to 3 hours. It is far, but not far enough. I feel Mexico is, as I've like to quote many times, the place where two tectonic plates are still colliding, Occidental ways and native ways. And I say that because I cannot really imagine what it was like when Cortés arrived there. In some, I wish I had them here, I don't brought them here in, but in Google you can find the way it looked in those days where Mexico City stands today. It is a huge, it was a huge lake, huge, a lot larger than it is to house 20 million people that are living there. At least this is what they are telling us since the 1990s. Nobody knows how many people live in Mexico City. More and more people are coming. Many of us living there come from indigenous communities. It was out of a project that began in the 1930s. In fact, shortly after the revolution, like Eduardo is telling us, when they decided that Mexico needed to be competitive to the rest of the world. That means the presidencies, people who, of course, won the revolution in Mexico, and decided that the best way was to move Indian people, to allure indigenous communities to Mexico because they needed, of course, a workforce. And some of the ways that they made them, they're really macabre in some ways because in the first place, the story of Mexico actually typifies a lot of the stories that we have heard today. And maybe there's not much time for that. But my point is that 20 million people living there together with industries, with cars, over 4.5 million cars moving in Mexico City, that's the estimation today. So much heat is created by the city that it simply creates such an immense volume of hot air moving into the upper areas of the sky, and that where we come from, the Mosca, is woodland, and it creates such a huge hurricane type of winds that just 3 years ago knocked down in one evening about 40,000 trees. For those who already been to the exhibition, that's what the horse is implying to be. At the same time, I'd like to talk a little bit about my work. In fact, the works you see here are just like the way I like to present ideas that I feel are far more important than making robots. You may have seen the machine that goes up and down, the butterflies. Well, they are allegories in some form to certain aspects of what we've been discussing today. For me, they are actually an interest in electronics because I believe that the electronic world is responsible for many of the things that we do, especially the way we behave, especially the way we think. And I like to quote, I say at this moment that the language that I speak, I learned it from my mother, but I learned it when I was already old. My mother didn't speak it because she was, of course, like in many other parts of the world, persuaded by her parents that it was best in order not to be discriminated. So the word Tecalco is the name of an AC, a non-profiting organization that my mother and my family runs together. And there, I think, in a way, the two things become together or come together. My practice as an artist and the environmental work that we are doing over there. These sort of things, I think, become more apparent when I, in the course of my reading, came across an anecdote that Russell Means says in his works that you can see in his discussion in the internet. He says that one day an elder of his part of the world, of his reservation, was told by a white man that he thought that if Indians were more proactive to work, then they would be better off. And the elder apparently answered that he understood very well what it meant to work, but what he didn't understand was the concept of vacation. And he explained it because you guys spend most of the year working to live a week or two the way we ought to be living, really. And I think that it typifies our way of thinking, but I wonder really where this way of thinking comes from, in a sense. The work that we do at Calpulli Tecalco, as I explained, is a non-profit organization. And when I was invited to this show and eventually to this talk today, I was in two minds whether to talk just about my work as an artist or the work that we do in Calpulli Tecalco. So it's neither of the two, but I have here you can see that more of the work of Calpulli Tecalco in the website that we have. San Pedro Atocpan is the town I come from. It's right at the heart of Mexico, exactly where, well, more or less exactly where the two sierras, the Sierra Madre Oriental and the Sierra Madre Occipital cross over. In fact, the north is just a little bit southern in Oaxaca, but this part of the world is highly mountainous, and Mexico City is 2,500 meters above the sea, and our town is another 200 meters above Mexico City. And the community is Atocpan. This is how it used to look not that long ago. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures of what we do at Calpulli Tecalco, because I'd like to explain a little bit more about what language are about, or what I interpret languages to be, and how they, in a way, reformat our way of thinking and perceiving the world. Where I come from is full of hills, and the hills have this, what I think is a very beautiful way of using the land. These are actually archaeological sites. We know this because at Calpulli Tecalco we've been working with the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, with two particular archaeologists, and we know for a fact that there are over 47 archaeological sites in the area. But what people don't know, and what my own community has forgotten, is that this particular feature of the hills was one day, not that long ago, places for cultivating, and more precisely for experimenting with different crops of maize corn, given the form that it has, and that some of the terraces are actually very, very narrow. In other words, that it was far too much work to have created such narrow terraces for the little yielding of whatever it was produced there. But now we know that it was corn, squash, and beans that were experimented. So this in pre-Hispanic times was actually a laboratory, an open-air laboratory. And we know also that some of these constructions date to the times of Teotihuacan, people who constructed the better-known pyramids of Mexico. So of this, we are very concerned, proud and concerned, because Mexico City is not that far away, and this is what we are experiencing today. Nothing new in that it happens everywhere in the world. But when we consider that there is a lot of, that Mexico, I think it ranks in the third place in biodiversity, then it's actually very important to not to just hold the city, it's already too large, but also to full-on try and resolve the different problems that the community faces. This is one of them, which incidentally, it is mostly poor people from the rest of the Republic that move into Mexico City in the allure that, of course, that the city is going to provide them with a better life. And they are appropriating in a squatting way the hills. Of course, everybody needs a place to live, and people are coming for, looking for bettering their lives. But it creates a lot of different corrupt systems, because I think from what you heard from Eduardo, Mexico built a mythology upon indigenous people, but has really become, in the process, what I believe, like many other people believe, a non-existent country. In other words, Mexico, I'm not afraid of saying it, is a failed state as a country completely, because right now is only second to Iraq in terms of one of the most violent countries in the world. In the last 6 years, over 22,000 people have disappeared totally and completely. Nobody's answering for this sort of crimes. The closeness that we have to the USA explains many things, but of course, in the last meeting that President Peña Nieto and Obama had, this in fact was deeply criticized because it is not really apparently a concern to the USA. It is said by the USA that many more people of their citizens have died to do with the war on drugs in Mexico, and in the territory of Mexico, and in the territory of the USA. The number is larger than the people dying, Americans dying in the Iraq war. In that sense, this is a problem that demands very little attention to authorities. Not alike to places like where I come from. And I like to say that we began in a more or less disorganized way, just simply responding to a situation that has become critical. It's not really visible there, but there are a lot of discarded cars there. It's an estimation that 30 cars per hour, something like that, are stolen in Mexico City. And they are used for all sorts of things. When they are done, mostly for criminal purposes, they chop them into pieces and discard them in the area of Milpalta. Some of the works we have done are more documentary, and perhaps whoever is interested can see them with more information in our webpage. But I have to do with the mountains. Milpalta, the 12 towns, have an area of 128,000 hectares. It is little known, for instance, in Mexico, that all this land, the land of the Momoshka, actually has enjoyed a much better quality of life than the rest of Mexico City, because right from about 1560, that is about 30 years or so after the conquest of Mexico, the Momoshka signed a treaty with the Spanish crown in which Momoshka people were guaranteed independence in exchange of becoming Christians. It is for that reason, perhaps, that Milpalta still is enjoying a better quality of life, but is rapidly disappearing along with the woodlands, as I was saying earlier. Incidentally, Milpalta has this, a lot of the woodlands are now in such a state, and but it still is a lot of not too eroded woodlands in Milpalta. But what makes it even more important is that the area is highly volcanic. In a lot of the rain that seeps through the mountain is collected in the infrastructure of the underground, and from then there is pumped out, and the area alone produces something like 50,000 square cubic meters a day of water that ends up in Mexico City. Meaning that to forget that the mountains are important for Mexico City is just simply suicidal. So we've been doing this type of work, and from Milpalta you can actually see the remnants of a lake Mezcliapan, that was called before the conquest. Nowadays is just a little, well, it's not even the size of, say, Nottingham. No, it's actually very, very, very small. When it used to cover a huge area in the mountains. So, what I'm trying to explain, perhaps, is that since colonial times, since the first contact, Mexico has become the center of where two diverse ways of looking at life are, of course, producing these results. But in Milpalta, we are using still some of all the terraces, and one of the main products is this type of cactus, which is actually help the society to practically not go through the recession that was very deep in the 1980s, simply because the communal spirit of the inhabitants is still very strong. And I started by explaining that, by saying that Milpalta are practically have forgotten the Nahuatl language. I'll be going a little bit faster now. My mother, 16 years ago, began teaching the language to kids. We have seen some really nice results, really good, excellent results with people who are nowadays at university with degrees. We carry on this type of workshops. And right from the start, the art has been very important in what we are doing. Part of it has been the studying of pre-Hispanic codices. These are just to show some examples of work that I have been doing in epigraphy. And because time is not allowing it, I'm just going to go to recap in saying that to me, the studying of electronics has taught me a few things, and I just like to point them out here. If this is true, according to this law of Laws More, the technology of the transistor is very close to collapse. Nowadays, the transistor is ever so small that there is simply no technology available to make way with the transistor. If this was the case, according to this law, the entire economy of the world would simply collapse, because every single thing in our days, of course, is moved by electronics, whether it's an investigation in the stratosphere, whether it's an investigation in the sea, everywhere, everything we touch through electronics. But what that means to me is that the electronics world, in a sense, has reformatted not only our whole conception of the way we look at the world. In the Nahuatl language, for instance, there is no conception of verb to be. It is very difficult for speaking Spanish or English to conceive culture without the verb to be. Another concept that is actually really interesting in the language is the total absence of the word rubbish. And it's always surprising me how in Spanish and in English we have so very many readily available words to connote rubbish. And what that means to me is that rubbish is actually born in our heads. Before it's actually presented in the outer world, first of all, it is inside of us. What hope do we have to reformat it, so to speak, our minds, if we were to carry on using the concept of rubbish? But what hope do we have when the transistor is about to collapse and virtually there will be a collapse in the economy worldwide, when it actually has helped us to build what we are? if there is a chance in the next 10 years of creating a new technology other than the transistor, fun or fantastic, you know. But my point really is that if we don't, we are in real deep trouble, because it's not just a question of Milpalta or the rest of the world, as we have heard. It's actually the entire world holding onto the device, the transistor. Just one last thing. I find that this is a really important statistic, even though it's 10 years old, because we are alarmed if the dolphins are dying or any other animal is dying, and we are prepared to put our money into that. But languages that have been created by, or rather, have they been created by ourselves, is something that is actually an important issue for mankind, because examples like the language, the Nahuatl language, are abundant in the world, especially when we consider that the areas with large biodiversity have created enormous numbers of languages, languages, perhaps we can say. But with our current technological language, I don't think we really have much hope, because politicians are ready to express that there will be a form of cleaner energy. There is no such thing as cleaner energy. The car, from the moment it's created, is rubbish. The moment it's running through the streets, everywhere it goes, is rubbish. There is a statistic about London, where in the 1910s, the transport had an average of 11 miles per hour because it was cars were pulled with horses. That statistic, it hasn't changed. So in over 100 years, there has been no progress in terms of using cars. I, for one, I really like to say this. I did have 2 cars when I was young, not at the same time. They were old. Crashed both of them, so I was really responsible, and decided not to drive. I have more than 30 years that I don't drive a car. I don't want to have a car, and I think everybody who really believes are environmentalists should stop using cars. That's it.
Well, thank you very much to all my panel. It raises, what they've said raises so many issues that I'm not sure where to start. One thing that Eduardo mentioned seemed to be important to me. He talked about the multidisciplinary practices amongst the artists in the exhibition. And I thought that was an interesting comment, because I'd like to just point out that the Maori scholar, Linda Smith, in her book called Decolonizing Methodologies, says that the Eurocentric imperialist point of view has been inherent in research practices. And to some extent, that might include art practices. It certainly would include, for indigenous peoples, would include archaeology and anthropology. So I wondered if the panel here have any thoughts on that notion of how to go about research, and whether you think about alternative methodologies, which, as Linda Smith says, the indigenous peoples are trying to develop. They might actually kind of coincide with some more imaginative artistic practices. But just one other point that we could talk about, and then I'll shut up, is that the theme that runs through all your work is around the archive, the museum, the collection, and research from that. And I think that's why this notion of research just like occupied my mind here. So I'm going to sit down. And then we will open everything to everyone's questions. Thank you. So,
yes, let me see if I understood correctly. You mean that how to integrate a diverse cultural diversity into the concept of research?
more like just and hello. More like the fact that, for example, you've done this satirical piece about how to blow up the Museum of Anthropology. I'd quite like to employ you to blow up the Tate Gallery because of crimes against art. But
Next.
But now I've lost the thread. It's to do with, it's the methodology of the museum that you're attacking, even though I might take you to task on the fact that you're blowing up the contents as well, because that's someone else's patrimony. And so for native peoples, sometimes it's the only place they can do to recuperate their heritage, if you like. So that's the thing. You were, like attacking the methodology of the museum.
Yes, well, not attacking in the sense that I want it to disappear immediately. If you think of it, the fact that is the only place where people can see these codexes, it's a confirmation of my unrest, because you could probably say that they should be somewhere else, or they should be available in a different form, etc. They are hoarded there, and so in a way, I guess my problem. Many people say, well, why don't you tear down the gallery? And I'm like, it's not that interesting. It could be everybody, it would be an easy thing because many people do not like galleries today. But the Museum of Anthropology is a very loved institution. And it's, if you go there, it's very lively, it's a positive thing for most people. What I think is that the problem is what is around it, what doesn't happen at the outside. And the fact that an institution like the museum, be it this one or elsewhere with different coordinates, serves as an alibi for the detrimental conditions around it, it should cause, give cause for a problem. I have this alternate map of the museum assignating each hall to a different ecological catastrophe, for example. Why don't we have a museum that tells you about all these issues? I think in many art places like this one, you can see some vestiges of what could be the Museum of World Conservation or something like that. So that's what I mean, basically. Right. It's not, and also, so I do not belong to any of these groups, and I cannot imagine even trying to be a spokesman for them. But I think that I am responsible for the fact that Mexico does this, and this is my culture too. So even if it relates to groups that seem foreign to me because I am westernized, I'm still part of my culture, and as writer Heriberto Yepes says, the country will not heal until it understands that this is their responsibility. It is our responsibility to heal this wound inside of us, because we are all Mexicans in a way. No, we share a history that is terrible, and I think that this may apply to Western museums too. I don't know.
We definitely need a museum of catastrophes. Yes.
Excuse me?
We need a museum of catastrophes. Yes.
Maybe.
But Fernando, you've chosen to investigate what has not been investigatable by white researchers, basically.
Well, I just started hinting at the idea of, well, a body of work that I've been doing in epigraphy. The entire countryside of Milpalta, of these 12 towns I was talking about, is named in Nahuatl still. And the mountains, the ravines, the farmlands, and so on and so on. When I didn't speak the language, I saw them just like everybody else did, or does in my hometown, which is just regarding the Avas as some product of human activity, and that's it. But learning the language is meant to me that I have the ability to see the countryside, same hills and so on, with very distinctive eyes. I was always envious of other indigenous groups that they talk about this reverence for the land, this reverence for mountains and so on. Till I learned the language, I realized that this is the case. Because every single mountain in Milpalta has a name like Cuauhtzin, which means revered eagle, Tlaloc, which means the god of rain, Teutli, which means the lord of dust, and till very recently they were still worshipped by many of the locals. The rest of the land is named still in that way. So then I know that where now there is a market, there was a arable land, a piece of land that is called, for instance, well, like our organization, Calpulli Tecalco. Tecalco means the house of stone. There is no house of stone anymore. So it's an alive way of noting for the environment. So in that sense, it does not just stop there. It also extends to the names of plants, like there's a plant called Sihuapachtli, which means the herb for women. It is a plant that was prescribed to women when, at the moment of child labor, because it the uterus and so on, and many more things like that. So in a way, if Eduardo was given his way, I wouldn't mind in a sense, because daily there are appearing many forms of memories, and I think this is not Mexico, because obviously what's the name of the city before Nottingham? The case that all the towns that finish in Chester and like Manchester and so on, they are for one or another reason, I don't know exactly, but they are Roman towns. Memory, in that sense, is not really restricted to objects. It's everything. The damage is obviously the scars that we are seeing everywhere else, and scars, of course, they are also memory. So, what if we create a world that is full of bad memories? Very little time we concern ourselves with thinking that I'm talking to my loved one and I'm saying beautiful things, and I'm talking to my enemy and I'm full of anger, and that the actual waves that are transmitting the sentiments, they're actually going through my body and everybody else's bodies. We have very little time to think about whether electricity as such is actually contaminated. We know that the seas are, that the stratosphere is. We don't stop to think that electricity itself is contaminated. I believe it is, because in the end, like you were hinting earlier, quantum mechanics point out everything is vibration. It is in that sense that perhaps I went too long, and perhaps I'm going too long here, but that I believe that the electronic world it really is such an artificial conscience that is enable us to see the world as if it was just a tangible object outside myself that doesn't allow me to actually perceive myself as part of it. One thing that I feel I'm very pleased about this event is to realize that many more cells around the world are now getting together and that we are creating a different type of conscience. We need to readdress the idea of conscience. I read somewhere in the electronic jargon that either we are all cyborgs or zombies. And the definition spans from the idea that when we started walking on two legs, basically our legs became kind of meaningless. You know, we don't get up in the morning and say, legs take me to school or something like that. We just simply don't appreciate them in that sense. And that's the definition of a cyborg that actually uses a technology and is not conscious of it. Of a zombie. Never mind telephones and so on.
I really liked that you brought up the book Decolonizing Research Methodologies, because I think it's really appropriate given the context of this conference and even the presentations, because I think art serves as this purpose of pushing the boundaries of the way we see things and perceive things and even digest things. And the presentation with the slideshow by, I can't remember your name. Mabe. Overlapping with the readings from the book really sort of contextualize these very different ways of seeing and knowing. And the book, Decolonizing Research Methodologies, talks about that Indigenous peoples view things from a very different lens and perspective. And as Indigenous people, reclaiming our place in this world in an attempt to protect our species and the thriving of our species on this planet is going to take shifting that lens in the way that we look at research and the way that we look at the earth as a whole. And the book really talks about how, as Indigenous people, we don't see things in that sort of linear path, and we don't understand things like fences and parameters and putting things in museums, and that there's this very, very different way of knowing and being and experiencing things. And I really liked what Cormac said in the beginning, which was that it's time for us to abandon this anthropocentric colonial illusion that we are separate from the natural world. And that sort of sentiment rings through true in the book of Decolonizing Research Methodologies. And I think this is where we're at, and this sort of cross-section of the activist world and artists pushing the boundaries of exactly that, research methodologies, how we understand and interact with our natural environment is really where we need to be going and really where we are going. And sometimes it's hard because it feels like in the urgency of climate change that we're not doing what needs to be done as quickly as it needs to be done. But as Indigenous peoples, we also, in the books, clearly states is that our process is very different. And so how do we start to bridge these gaps? And my nation is trying to do that. We're really, really trying to merge Western science and research methodologies with our own research methodologies, the way that our elders perceive the natural environment. You know, our data is sometimes at odds with the Western data. So, you know, we say caribou go here, and they're like, oh, well, we collared 12 caribou, and they didn't go in this region. Well, and it's like, well, I killed one there last winter, so they obviously go there. And so the oral histories and it's just, we're in a really interesting time where I think we need to slow down a little bit and listen to ourselves as a species that exists in a symbiotic relationship with the environment. Even though there's this sort of state of urgency that we have to address climate change. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling now, but yeah.
May I ask a question? How do you regard the possibility of reproducing your culture, your nations? Because the last time I went to Washington, I went to this museum that they have of the American, how's it called?
The American Indian.
The
Yes.
American Indian, and I was very surprised. It did have the participation, not like the museum I talked about, of the people of the nations, and it was very strange to try to how they tried to figure out how to preserve oral tradition by means of some sort of talking device, you know. So my question would be, given this technological research and these decolonized possibilities, what is a vision that you have? I think you participate in that. I just wanted you to elaborate. How can this be reproduced? Can it be saved from technological?
It's a really complex, it's a complex question, because there's ideas of intellectual property rights, and even when it comes to documenting the medicinal properties of plants and medicines that our people use traditionally. One of the presenters earlier today said that the community was mapping out their territories and the medicines, but they were keeping it for the preservation of their own community. So it's like, how much do you share for the wider world, and how much do you preserve and keep within your communities for that protection because of the electronic world and being able to, you know, people can steal the intellectual property, right? And you talked about it earlier about, you know, are we just going to borrow from the people and to give us back some life and then abandon them again? Everything is a fine balance, I think. And for our nation, we definitely don't share everything, and there's a lot that we retain and keep wholly in our community. But technology does serve. I think maybe for my community, I can say is that we use technology and social networking as a way to share that we're still here and that we exist and that we have rights to exist in the way that we do. And I think that that is how we can use technology in a way that is respectful. And again, every nation is very different in the way that they use it.
Maybe I could add, just from the experience of the World of Matter, which is a collective that Ursula Beeman has initiated and that I'm part of. We take as a methodology and as an impulse of work as a collective of artists to produce raw material for research. So everything is open in a way. Most of our works are available on internet, even as raw materials, even as things that we don't edit in our pieces, as a way that this knowledge that we compile can be useful for activists, professors, for whoever wants to make use of it. So in a way, World of Matter, in terms of this methodology, implied not for the sake of communities and specifically about the indigenous, but as a group of artists that have this impulse, this wish that wherever we go to produce about the reality or about certain things that we are discussing and working from, that we make it available on electronic means, sharing.
Thank you, Mabe. Thank you. I've been told we don't have time for questions from the floor. Hopefully you'll be able to catch our speakers if you have questions. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.